Awesome. That's exciting. It's a good time to get into real estate, believe it or not.
Like I kind of got out of real estate. Now I'm kind of getting back into real estate.
Okay, cool. Well, you're doing the right thing if you're here for class, so that's awesome.
Good.
Well, I'm going to talk for the first half and kind of review some common mistakes in offers. A couple of weeks ago, I asked people to write an offer for a specific property. So I'm going to touch on some of the common things that came up in those, and then we'll have discussion for the second half. So we'll talk about offers and anything else that's come up for people, recently, and kind of talk through that stuff. We've got until 11:30. Well, we're past the 10:30 mark, so I'm going to get started. So first of all, shout out to the people who did turn in an offer, who took the time to put that together a couple weeks ago, and that was Jennifer Hanley, Heidi Bird, Alex, Amanda Schultz, Tiffany Williams, April Bates, and Jessica Lowry, who took the time to write an offer and send it to me. So thank you.
And me.
Oh, and Jackie, sorry, and Jackie. I didn't miss anybody else, did I? I don't think
Did
so.
you say, I don't know if you said my name, Catherine.
And Catherine, yeah.
Submitted one.
You know what? I didn't, because I didn't draw a little underline, just like Jackie.
Mine was a little late. I had never done an offer before. It was like day 2. So I was
Yeah.
slowly but surely getting it done.
Yeah, way to jump in. And it's really great to have, I think sometimes we need a little push of like, I know I need to do that thing and it seems like a daunting task, or this is the boring part of the job that I really don't want to spend my time on. I just want to look at houses. But super important to your success as an agent, super important to how you best represent your clients, which is going to translate into repeat business and referrals. So it's imperative that you understand and use the the offer contract and documents to the best advantage of your client, and also that you understand every bit of it. The better you understand what's in that document, the better off you are with explaining things to your clients, understanding the process, knowing how to make that work to their best advantage, and also how to navigate the process with your co-broke, because it's possible that the other agent doesn't know the offer as well as you do.
Sure.
So having that good base is so, so important. So there were a number of things that were really great in the offers. I think overall, I was really impressed that people clearly took the time, filled them out carefully. They didn't appear rushed or thrown together. And I cannot tell you how often I do receive offers when I'm listing a property that look rushed and thrown together and messy with simple mistakes that could really cost their client. So kudos to everybody for taking the time to write it. And it looked like, for the most part, review before sending it over. A couple of things to point out. We had a few people who did an awesome job with either preparing a cover page or in the email, giving a breakdown of the details of the offer. For listing agents right now, if anybody's written an offer recently or tried getting a hold of a listing agent about something, they are crazy busy. Has anybody come across that, where they've like just tried to build that relationship with the agent before they get their offer in, or tried to get a question answered, and it's like clearly that person is getting overwhelmed by people wanting to know more about that property? So it's definitely typical right now that listing agents are getting, 10 plus calls a day over one listing. And so they're overwhelmed with communication. And so when you send over an offer, it's a really great idea to make their job easier, simpler, clearer. Sending over a cover page or detailing the offer in the email can be a really nice way to just keep it very clear. The one thing to be careful of is when you do that, double check that whatever you put in your cover, whatever you put in your email, matches what's in the offer. Obviously, if you put something different, what holds true is what's in the offer document. So just make sure you're double checking that. It's also a great way to make sure that your client's on the same page with you, communicating, this is what's in your offer. When I send over an offer for a client to sign after we've filled it out in zip forms, I'll send a cover page with it. So they can look at that first to see, yep, that's what I intended. You could even have them initial it. And And then obviously they get the offer documents too. So kudos to the people who did that. That's a really, really nice additional thing you can do that doesn't take that much time. It's a good way to check your work, run everything by your client one more time, and it's a very nice benefit to the listing agent. So great step forward into that relationship potentially, and could help your offer stand out against other offers in a good way. The other thing, when you send that offer, don't forget to reach out to the agent. I find text messaging being a good way to communicate that in this scenario. So you've maybe called them before with questions, you've put the offer together, you texted to say that it's coming, you'll be sending it at X time, so they know it's coming. And then once you send it in, sending a follow-up text to say, hey, I just emailed this offer to you. When you have a moment, could you please confirm it came through? So just really covering all your bases. When so many emails are flying in, when so much activity is happening around one property, it's really nice as a listing agent to just get a little like, hey, just want to let you know, like, I don't need an immediate reply, but before you present, if you could just let me know you got that, is really a good way to follow up, because it could get lost. I did have some specifics on how the email subject line should be set up. Not everybody followed that. Most people didn't. I put that out there as a listing agent when I send an email through showing time to say, if you're interested in writing an offer, this is what the subject line should be. That is number one, to help me organize my offers and make sure I don't miss any. And number two, it's a test. If you can't follow that simple direction, navigating this process with you as an agent, I kind of know what I'm getting into. So, simple thing to do, basic subject line, offer, the property address, and then maybe the buyer's last name. So it's very clear what this is. If you have to scan documents in, don't just leave the like XY scan Z ... Like what is that? I don't know what that is when I'm going through my email, right? So just make sure it's really clear and you're really following up on that. The other thing, and I know this is a practice offer, but an offer should include not just the WB11, but what else? Addendum A, which a lot of people did use, but I found that a lot of people use the WRA Addendum A, and there's actually a GMAR Addendum A. It's a little more comprehensive, and it includes the agent contact info at the bottom, and that is really nice to keep everyone on the same page as far as the title company's concerned, the lender, you, the other agent. Everybody's on the same page with who is which representative, buyer or seller side, what the contact information is for that, their license number, all of that jazz is at the bottom. So when you're finding an addendum A, if you go into zip forms and you start a file for a new client, there's a drop-down menu when that box first pops up, and you can select residential offer to purchase, and that automatically plops the GMAR addendum A into there. So when you're putting that together, just make sure you find that document. The WRA one is fine. It just doesn't have everything in it, and it's less common to use that. So it might look a little funny to an agent who is looking at it as a listing agent. The other thing is, when you put an offer together, don't forget the condition report and the addendum S. And if you're not sure what you should remember, or what should be included, just look through the offer. It says right in there, the condition report on this date, yada yada. In the addendum A, you usually check the box that says the addendum S, lead paint disclosure. Don't forget those documents. They're super important to review with your clients and make sure they sign them. You have to sign them too. And in the addendum S, there's a little section of boxes, and you should be clicking on one of those boxes to say whether your client wants lead paint testing or not. The most common one is the last box that says they're passing on their opportunity to have a lead paint test. But make sure you don't forget that checkbox. That's another one of those following directions things that I look for as a listing agent. How detailed is this person? Are they on top of things? Do they understand the contracts? Are they complete and thorough and thoughtful? Or are they rushed and, that's fine, no big deal. Like, I don't want to work with somebody who's like, that's kind of gray area, it's fine. That's when stuff gets weird. So just check the box and then make sure you sign too. So addendum S, condition report, addendum A, GMAR addendum A preferred. And and the WB11 offer to purchase. And then of course, pre-approval, which for these offers, you didn't actually have one, but that's a really good thing to ask for at the beginning. As soon as your buyer gets a pre-approval, look at it. Look at the details, ask them questions. You know, is this your preferred down payment? Did they, you know, do you have to have an FHA loan? Do you have the option of conventional? You know, just a reminder, this interest rate that's on here is not a guarantee. It's likely to change between now and the time you lock in your rate, which is only going to happen after your offer is accepted and you turn in the documents to the lender. And then the buyer decides to lock in the rate. So just for them to keep that in mind. The other good thing to do is, if you don't know this lender especially, check in with them. They're crazy busy right now. So don't wait until you're writing the offer and you've got a half hour and they need to get back to you. So check in with them, you know, maybe on a weekly basis, or at least when you first get the pre-approval, and just say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm working with this buyer. We have a pre-approval with you. Just to check in, what are your timelines looking like right now? How long is reasonable for a loan commitment? How long is reasonable for a loan commitment? That's huge. You're going to put that in your offer. You better make sure that they can follow through on that. How long is reasonable for a closing date? How are your appraisals running right now? So ask those questions in advance. And if you haven't talked to that lender in a while, check back. So how long for loan commitment? How long for appraisal and closing? Usually your appraisal and your loan commitment timeline, you put in the same number of days, but typically, you know, 30 days is pretty tight right now. There are a few lenders who can pull off a little bit less than that, like 25, 27 days, but anything less than that is impossible because the appraisal process takes a while. Appraisers are really busy. They've got a ton of refinances to appraise and new purchases, and there's only so many appraisers in, you know, Southeast Wisconsin. So you want to make sure you're allowing enough time that that can actually happen. The one time really that the seller can walk away legitimately is if your loan commitment's not in on time. So it is super important that you put a realistic time frame for that. Checking in with the lender ahead of time is that next step, professional approach to how to do this. And you can say to the buyer or to the listing agent, you know, we checked in with the lender on these dates and deadlines. So you could even put that in your cover page. I usually do. You know, we work with this lender often. They're great. They confirmed these deadlines. So it's just another layer that protects your client. It's that next step of going above and beyond. It's that true professional approach and not just a hobby kind of an approach. Other than that, inclusions and exclusions. So when you're writing an offer, one of the best things to do is just have the listing in MLS up on your screen or on your phone. I kind of work off my computer screen on my phone where I'm like looking at both things. You're going to have to pull the addendum S, which, yes, lead paint disclosure is only for homes built after before 1978 because of lead paint. And the condition report and any other extra documents will be in there. So you'll need to pull those anyways to put into your zip forms. And then also all the details are there, like the inclusions and exclusions. And that is on the offer. And I got a variety of inclusions and exclusions on these offers. Some were exactly what I had in there, and you can literally copy out of MLS and paste into your offer. So you don't make any mistakes, you don't miss anything. So your buyer is fully aware of what's included and not included, and be sure to mention that to them. You don't want to get to like final walkthrough and they're like, where's the washer and dryer? And you're like, well, it's not included. Well, yeah, it's in the offer they signed, but did they really see that? So just make sure you're doing them the courtesy of reviewing those important bits and pieces as you go. You don't want them to feel like salty about a washer and dryer on their walkthrough instead of excited about the house. So make sure you're checking those inclusions and exclusions. If there's something your buyer really wants or really doesn't want, you could consider putting it in there in the exclusions or inclusions, but I would just warn you, any little like finicky stuff like that in a heavy competition might come across the wrong way. So it depends on how important it really is to them, or is this something we could discuss later and maybe figure out. The other thing that's in there is just double checking the address, double checking that the city is right. all of those little details that get filled in automatically, just make sure you've got those correct and complete. At the top of the pages that don't have any address, or pardon me, at the top of the pages that aren't the first page, there's an address line at the top. Just make sure that's filled in all the way. So not just the street number and the street name, but also the city. And that's something you can go back and check and click on and correct, and it'll autofill the rest of the pages. So just something to watch for. It's from the days when we did this on paper, and you might lose page 4, and then you're like, what offer is this for? I don't know. So that's why it's on there. So it's a little ancient, but.
Amanda, can I ask you a real quick question about that?
Sure.
Because it's West Allis, but the default always says Milwaukee. And I know that like we live in Bayside and sometimes it defaults to Milwaukee anyway. So what was the correct thing to do? Because I put West Allis on the first page and then it defaulted to Milwaukee for the rest of it.
Yeah, and actually it is Milwaukee. It was a mistake. So when in doubt, check the tax records in MLS, and that should tell you what it is. It should also tell you, like, is it a city? Is it a town, a village? That's a good question, Heidi. Yeah, and don't forget that line about city, town, village, whatever it is, and the county too. Yeah, excellent question. Other things that came up were in the financing contingency, or the financing commitment contingency. That chunk does require a little math. And it's really important that you confirm that with your client when you're filling it in, and you're not just like, oh, the purchase price, and like, this sounds like a nice, principal and interest maximum. I'll just write that number in. So here's the best way to do that. First, double check the pre-approval. Make sure you really know what the down payment planned is. Double check it with your buyer and also with what's on the pre-approval. Okay, so 10% down is your plan. Yes, great. Oh, what if we want to do 15? Can we do 15? Okay, here's the deal. The financing contingency is to protect you. So if you want to do 15, you can. I'm sure your lender's okay with you putting more money down. However, if we put 15% in this offer, then if suddenly you can't do 15% anymore and you can only do 10, or your lender says you have to do 15 in order to get this loan, you have to move forward, because that's what's in your offer. Now, if you put 10 in, you say 10% is going to be my down payment, and you decide to do 15 down, yay for you. That's great. I don't think your seller is going to have an issue with it. We could make an adjustment, but they're probably not going to have a problem with you having more cash on hand. But then if you wanted to do 15 and you can't, you're protected because you've got this 10% as your maximum down payment. If it's got to be more than that, I can't do that. And this is saying I need a loan with 10% down, and my lender sent me this letter and said, you can't have a loan with 10% down. You have to put 15% down. And this is my evidence of why I can't get this loan that I put in this offer. And that's their door out. So it's a financial protection to them, and it's if anything changes with lending. So it does tell the seller how strong of a buyer they are to some extent because of what their down payment is, but it's also really there for their protection in case something changes for them financially. The other piece of that is the principal and interest. So there's that little line, a couple lines down from the price, that says, or pardon me, from the loan amount. So loan amount is after down payment. So if it's like 150 is the offer, down payment's 20,000, 130 is what goes in the loan amount. And then your principal and interest payment is best done with a mortgage calculator, or sometimes the lender might have that on their letter. But make sure if you're copying what's on the letter, that the loan amount is exactly what's in the offer you're writing. So they might have a pre-approval for more than the offer they're writing. Don't copy that principal and interest. It's not the same. So what you're building principal and interest off of in a mortgage calculator is your 150 purchase price. You put in your, $20,000 down payment. You put in the interest rate that you put in this contingency, maximum interest rate, 3.5%, say. Use that, and then the principal and interest is built off of that. So that's what goes into that little line. So just make sure that lines up and run it by your buyer. This is just your principal and interest payment. It doesn't include taxes or insurance. This is just to give you an idea of what that amount is. Also, when you're putting in that interest rate maximum, be aware of what rates are generally at right now. And if you really don't know, talk to a lender. They'll be happy to put you on their mailing list where they send out the interest rates every week. My guy at Equitable does that all the time. It's going to vary a little bit. So best case scenario, you talk to the lender to find out, okay, we know we can't lock in right now. Your buyer thinks they're going to be at about 3.2, but they're hoping for 2.9, but they don't really know. They're buy down points and yada, yada. Just like get within the range, within 0.5 ideally. So if you had, 3.25, 3.5 on, if you wrote an offer today, that's very much within the reasonable range. You could even try 2, but check in with the lender if you're not sure. Just double check that information with the expert and make sure that you're doing your due diligence and not just like guessing a number. If you had 4% or 4.5 in there and me as the listing agent is looking at this offer, my first thought is either this person has some major financial issues that they have this crazy high rate, or their agent doesn't know what they're doing, or if the rates go up, we're looking at such a jump. Is this buyer very aware that this is the maximum that's in there? Because if the rates jump and they're going to have a problem, they're tied in. Like the rate goes up 1% and they're tied in, that could totally change their monthly payment, which might be fine, but it just makes me question it because it stands out as different. Does that make sense? So just keep in touch with what's going on, and when in doubt, see the expert, talk to the lender, or talk to your go-to lender for some advice. If you need specifics, go to the buyer's lender. Other than that, timeline on financing and timeline on appraisal, not only make sure that those are realistic with the lender, but also do they match up with your closing date? So thing to keep in mind, closing date, 3 business days before that, here, I'll go this way. 3 business days before that is when the closing disclosure is due. Those are final numbers. So ideally, your financing doesn't go all the way up until your closing date. Ideally, you give those 3 business days so that the loan commitment comes in, the numbers are finalized, and you get that closing disclosure 3 business days before closing. That's ideal. If you have to squeeze it tighter, talk to the lender first, but make sure those numbers work. Also, make sure that your timeline for your appraisal isn't like a week after closing. Who does that help? So it needs to make sense within the time frame. Closing day is the absolute last day, and we know that by a date. So you're gonna have to count. Okay, that's like 40 days, and then okay, so my loan commitment 45 doesn't make sense. I'd have to pull that back. Can I do 38? Okay, yep, I talked to the lender. They said as long as they had within 35 or more days, that would work. Great. So you're gonna have to do some math and double check these things. It is absolutely worth doing. You are not done once you write the offer, you are just starting. And so if you just throw stuff in there, you're gonna later have to deal with the consequences if the offer gets accepted. Or maybe the offer doesn't get accepted because the stuff in there didn't make sense. And an agent just didn't want to take the time to have to counter back to fix your messes. Don't give them messes to fix. Give them a complete offer that they can just sign acceptance. That's a huge thing that comes up all the time. Like just save the time, save your client the stress. Just have it complete and correct the first time.
Yep.
Someone have a question?
Yep, Jessica. Are those when we're talking about those days, are they business days or calendar days?
So that's a good question. So the way the dates and deadlines work, and there's a couple lines in the offer about this. It's days, it's calendar days, and day 1 is the day after accepted offer. So when you're counting out your dates and deadlines after you have an accepted offer, I highly recommend you write all of those down. You give them all to your client to tell them what each of these things is for, and then put them in your calendar. And if you use Google Calendar, put them in your calendar and invite your client. So everybody has the same things on your calendar. And that way later when you're negotiating inspection, you're not like, oh shoot, are we past the deadline? I don't even know. Yeah. So I also recommend sending them to the other agent, but do it in a careful way, right? So some people have a bit of an ego about this job. So just say, hey, I'm just double checking to make sure I have the dates right. Here they are. And that just keeps you all on the same page. You could even send it to the lender if you wanted. But yeah, it's good to, at the end of the day, we all benefit from doing this on time and not scrambling or going past deadlines. That's when it gets a little ugly. Good question. There are people who put in there, and I think at least one person did this, where there's a line you can add that says any due date or deadline that falls on a national holiday or a weekend is automatically extended to the next business day. You do have to write that in though. You know, sometimes that happens where, you know, we don't know exactly when it's going to get accepted. Things could end up being scooted. You know, we're not going to get the loan commitment on a Sunday. Well, bank's not open. So it's not a bad idea to do that. Just be aware of that when you are setting up your due dates and deadlines in your calendar. Also, when you're writing your closing date, just make sure it's a weekday. Don't like rely on that line to fix your mistake. Just make sure it's a weekday. That's an easy thing to check. And another thing, you don't want somebody being like, well, everything's great, but I have to counter because you didn't look at a calendar for the closing date. Come on. Come on. When it comes to the inspection contingency, this is something I come across with inspection contingency and with the testing, which is in addendum A, the testing contingency. This is partially a personal peeve and also kind of a lazy approach. It certainly can protect buyers, but I think there's a better way to do it, and it's definitely to a seller's disadvantage, and that is when you fill out or it's a moot point. So when you fill out an inspection contingency, there's that extra line that's like, also looking at blah, blah, blah. So the contingency itself already says they're going to look at the whole property, right? So they're going to look at all the major parts and components of the house. That's built into the contingency. So it says it's a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector. They're performing a home inspection of the property after the date on line 1 of this offer to purchase, which discloses no defects. So it's further contingent upon a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party performing an inspection of X. Now we already know from the lines above that they are going to be looking at the whole property. They're going to conduct inspections of the entire premises. Observation of the property does not include an appraisal or testing. It's just an overview. That's built in. You don't have to write on that line an inspection of entire premises. It's already a given. The premises is what's being inspected. But if you want to add something specific, like you saw, like your buyer heard about having a sewer scope done. That's the latest thing. Some inspection companies are starting to offer that. That repair can be expensive. It's hard to tell if there is a problem. So adding that in would go there, you know, sewer scope. Or, you know, if there was things like water testing, well testing, septic system, those things are built into the GMAR Addendum A. They have their own contingency. So just make sure you're aware of what's in the documents and just use them as they're provided. Then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, they're already written there in an enforceable way. When it comes to the testing contingency in Addendum A, the intention of that is to name a specific test or specific tests. The way it's written in there in parentheses, there's some examples. So it's like, you know, lead paint or mold or asbestos. That's what you specify in there. If you put in buyer wants testing, anything recommended by home inspector, that means the seller, and this is good if you have a listing as well, that means the seller is upfront agreeing to any test the home inspector says should be done. They have no say in the matter from this point on. The inspector says it needs to be done. You can do it as a buyer's agent or as a buyer. You know, it's great for your buyer, gives them a lot of protection, any option to test whatever they want. If they don't really know what they want to test for, there's no evidence of anything that needs to be tested, and they don't intend to test for it like when the inspection happens, this may be a further conversation down the line. Or if there's something they're really worried about, even if they're not going to test it immediately, maybe they are worried about asbestos. You can put that in there and maybe explain to the agent, like, this is a concern, we've got it in there just in case, but we're going to wait and see what the inspector says before we order this. So make sure you give yourself enough time for that to happen as well in that contingency. But just blanket putting in whatever the inspector recommends is not really what that's intended for, and is kind of built into the inspection contingency. If the inspector says, bring in an expert for X, Y, Z, that's built into the contingency, and you go back to the seller and say, Here's what the inspector said we need to look at, and you bring in somebody else.
So just a question.
Yeah.
So in a competitive market like this, how do you weigh the merits of putting in like additional inspections and tests versus it killing your deal?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, putting in any additional tests is rare. It's unusual. It's going to be harder to get it passed, to get it accepted. It will. And you can be forthright with your buyers about that. You have the right to test whatever you want. Here's some examples. This is why. Do you feel like you need to test this before closing? Is this something you could investigate after? I often have that discussion with people about radon. If the most important thing is getting the offer accepted, and the risk is the radon mitigation costs around $1,000. If it needs to be done, then maybe that's something you do at a later time if you're comfortable with that risk and that cost. So having those discussions in advance is really important. I cannot tell you how stressful these inspection navigations are right now. These negotiations are 10 times harder than they used to be. Everybody is so on edge. Everybody is so sensitive. The world is falling apart around them. They have control over nothing, and deals are falling apart over $100. It's the craziest thing, but people are just feeling like they have no control over anything. And if you're watching the market, homes are strategically priced under market value. So people are paying 10, 15, 20, 25,000 over asking price. They're not overpaying. They're paying market value. There's an appraisal that supports that, or maybe it doesn't, and that's their safety net. But ultimately, people are walking in feeling like they're in the hole 20 grand, and they're just not. That's just how the pricing is working right now. And it's important to have that conversation with your client in advance as well. Ultimately, if we're trying to get the offer accepted, it's important that it's clean, but here's the risk to you if you don't do this. So you as an agent have an obligation to not just say, don't include that, it's not going to get accepted, but why? And what options do they have? This is something you could do. However, here's how a seller is going to see it. This is something you could do later. This would be the potential cost to you or risk down the line. How do you feel about that? Because it's one thing to write a stellar offer and get it accepted, but if it gets accepted and then they immediately start to melt down over, oh my God, what did I do? I paid $20,000 more than I should have. I agreed to no testing. What am I doing? And they've got family in their ear who bought a house 4 to 15 years ago who had none of this to deal with in the market. It feels crazy. So it's important to help them understand what their options are and why this is happening in the market and what their potential outcomes could be down the line. You can't say for sure, but
do you have examples of where you kind of urged them to get a test or inspection, or do you usually lean back and let the buyer make the call?
My personal approach is to give them the best information I can and let them make the call. Mm-hmm. Because if you push them to do one thing or another, if they start digging around on Google later and they're like, oh my God, we're going to die from radon and you told us not to have it. We can't afford a mitigation system. We want out and this is crazy and the world's ending. Like, that's what will happen. So just make sure you're giving them the resources you can. And with the caveat, like, here's an EPA attachment about radon. Just an FYI, it's going to look terrifyingly scary. Here's the basics. You can have the test now. We can ask the seller to pay for the mitigation. They may or may not say yes, but this is a potential where you could get out of the contract or they would have a cost. So to the seller, it's not a great thing. If you're worried about radon, but you don't care about the mitigation cost, you could do it after closing. You could have the test done. You could control the environment of the test. You might have the cost of mitigation at that point. I'm not saying don't do a radon test ever, but maybe this is a better way to navigate it within the contract. Other things, if I notice things, I might point them out. This might be something you want to have looked at. Testing for mold gets a little hairy, is because there's no exact number. Like, this is not okay mold. This is okay mold. Like, everybody has different sensitivities. So if you notice something, it would be something to have an inspector look at. You may want to put in there, mold and mildew expert. Keep in mind, if you specifically say that in advance, that's a red flag to a seller. These guys are detailed. They're going to be a pain to work with. We might have some mitigation on our hands. So it's really an art of how much do you show your cards, what do you hang on to, what works with the way the offer is written without adding a bunch of stuff. Can you rely on that inspection to say the inspector pointed this out and recommended an expert, now we can bring in an expert, and just giving yourself the time to do that. So it's a bit of a dance. And you really, really have to understand and read your clients to know how comfortable they're going to be with these sorts of things. And if they're brand new, like off the street, you never met them before, you might not know right away. So, you know, running those scenarios of like, how would you feel if, you know, you tested later and the radon came in high and you had to pay for mitigation? Would that be okay with you? It's about $1,000. How do you feel about that? You know, kind of giving them scenarios to run through their heads so that when they get their offer accepted, they feel really good about it and they're not suddenly spiraling of all the stuff they didn't include. And how could you tell them not to have anything in there? And mom and dad are like, but you're not even protected because when we bought in 1994, we didn't have to have this. Like, just make sure you're explaining it and explaining it again, and then like putting it on paper and then following up after. Really key that they understand those pieces. And it's why it's important to have a buyer consultation, and it's why it's important to provide information that you'll go back to and talk more about as you go. So like, you've got all these showings, use the time to talk about this stuff. You know, don't wait until you're writing an offer. It's going to take you like 3 hours to write an offer if you have to explain every dang thing in the offer. They should have some idea in advance, and tell them that my goal is that by the time we write your offer, you are comfortable with what is in the offer. That's my goal. Let's make sure we're talking about that. Let's make sure you're coming to me with your questions and concerns. Let's make sure if your mom and dad have opinions, I know what they are and we can address them before we write your offer.
Amanda,
so that they know that's something they need to work on. Yeah.
can you touch base on, because there are a lot of houses now, because it's a seller's market, that are putting them on as is, and how that relates to asking for testing or, you know, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So in my experience, it does vary what that means. If you're dealing with a foreclosure or, you know, a bank-owned property, it's very likely they truly are going to do nothing. So like the way the property is now is what it's going to be. You can usually have a home inspection. They say, you know, you're welcome to have one for information's sake, but whatever's found in there is what the buyer is going to take on. If there are major defects, could you still use them to exit the contract? As long as they truly are major defects and there's nothing additional in the offer that says anything about defects. Make sure whatever they disclosed, if they disclose major defects, if those exact same things in the same condition come up as a problem in the inspection, the way the offer is written, boilerplate, you can't use those things to get out. So just make sure you're really aware of what's in there and how it's written. But typically you can have an inspection and take on whatever. Now, if it's something like an investor property or an estate or something like that, they may say as is. I would recommend seeing what you can find out from the agent. Are they hard and fast they're going to do nothing? Because I have listings where the seller's like, we're not going to do anything. They can come in and have an inspection, whatever, but we're not going to do anything. Put it as is. Okay, sure. So I put it as is. And then they're like, well, if there's like a few things they want, it's not a big deal. We'll do them. Or let's kind of see what they ask. So it's a bit blurry. So it's not a hard and fast, we're not going to do anything, but I would prepare my buyers to understand that that's probably the case. They're telling us up front, you can have an inspection, but we're not doing anything. Does that mean they'd give a credit? Maybe. I would find that out ahead of time, but I would definitely not set the expectation that the inspection contingency is going to lead to a closing cost credit, a warranty, a price change, a repair of some sort. If they're saying as is, the offer you're writing should be the offer you end up with, unless the appraisal doesn't come through.
So if it's an as is and you do an inspection, just so your buyers have some kind of good information about what's wrong or whatever, you do what do you do with the right to cure clause then?
I mean, you could still put it in.
Okay.
It's unlikely they're going to exercise it. So when you're explaining how that works, make sure your buyer understands. Right to cure, remember, only goes into effect if you issue a notice of defects. Right to cure does not mean you can ask the seller for repairs. You can always ask the seller for repairs. They can say yes or no. If they're selling as is, you know, they're probably not going to do repairs. So probably not write an amendment, just call the agent and talk to them. But right to cure only comes into effect once a notice of defects is issued. So you can still ask for repairs, whether they're defects or not. You can ask for credits, whatever. If you can't come to an agreement and there are major defects, you issue a notice of defects. That's when the seller can decide, do I exercise my right to cure or not? So right to cure does not mean you can negotiate repairs. It comes after that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I talked to you about this last night. So my seller wants to do repairs, cannot get his contractors in any type of fashion. This is the most nightmare deal that I'm hoping I will ever deal with because it's colossal. And so we come back saying, you can still sign. We have not issued a notice of defects. We merely requested repairs. And they said, yes, we want to do it. Yes, we want to do everything, but he can't get quotes enough. So my buyers got a quote from someone. So I sent it over to them so maybe they can use it. And they have until 5 o'clock tomorrow. And now the listing agent is out of town today and will not be in the office until tomorrow afternoon. And my buyers need to take out money from a 401k. They're running out of time to even get that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what to do with this. Do I have to issue a notice of defects? Like, I can't get anyone to respond. I can't get anything except my client that's losing her mind.
So, and this is coming up a lot, especially right now where people are like, almost never does an agent say like, I'm not going to be available until you send them a document. And they're like, well, I can't get this back to you. I'm on the lake today. And you're like, oh, that would have been nice to know. This is that whole like accountability to your co-broke that I talked about last week. Like if you're going to be gone and you really want to be gone, just tell people in advance. Make sure you're checking those dates and deadlines to make sure that it doesn't affect that. And if it does, you better have a backup plan because this is your dang business, for Pete's sake. So it does come up though. I had this come up the other night. It adds stress and pressure to a situation that's already stressful with some very sensitive buyers. And ultimately, you can be prepared for a couple scenarios. You can say, well, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. We know they're probably not going to do anything with it tomorrow. I've asked if there's any way they can review this or get it back to us. But if they can't, when are they going to be in the office when they come back? And when can we expect a reply? Hold them to some kind of timeline as best you can. And I would recommend just have a notice of defects done, signed by the buyers, and in your possession so that if you don't get a response and you're getting down to the deadline, you can turn that in and protect them. They know that's not their preferred method or their priority. The alternative is, cool, have a vacation. But because everything is contingent on timeframes, we want to send over an amendment that we're going to extend all these deadlines. Then you can have your vacation, not have to worry about this, but we need to make sure we're keeping on top of everything else that's due. And the only way to handle that is to stretch out these deadlines. So a proactive thing you can do when you first get an accepted offer is like, yay, we're so excited. Thank you for considering our offer and accepting it. Here's the dates and deadlines I have. Also, just wanted to check, are you going to be on vacation or are there certain days of the week you are not available? Because I want to make sure that when we get information to you, when we get amendments to you, that we're considering your schedule. I would love for somebody to ask me that. Oh my God, I don't actually have to work on my day off, which always ends up being a work day. Fabulous. I'm so thrilled that somebody is asking me this question so I don't have to feel like a jerk for saying that I take off a day a week. Ask them ahead of time or take the time to say, hey, just wanted to let you know, I checked all the dates and deadlines and they don't seem to fall on Sundays. I'm usually not available on Sundays. So I just wanted to give you a heads up for that. The more we communicate with each other, the smoother this goes. It really sucks when you get to the point where you've got a deadline and then somebody's like, don't care, have a day off, talk to you in 72 hours. And then you're just like, I can't do anything and I'm waiting. What do I do? And it happens all the time. So It is unusual to be proactive about it, but it's a really good idea. And in the event that you can't make that work, maybe you can at least get them to have the sellers sign an extension. And if you can't, just be really diligent about watching the clock on that day they get back, making sure you have some idea of when they're back on the clock, when are they going to review it, it's due by this time. And then if if they don't respond by 5 and your contingency ends at midnight, be ready with another amendment, be ready with a notice of defects. Just you have the documents ready to go. So you're not like, oh, now we have to write this thing and I have to get you to sign it. Just have it ready. You don't have to execute, deliver it fully if you have it written and signed, but at least then you have it in hand. It may be more work than necessary, and like, get used to being frustrated with your co-brokes, guys, because not everybody is as professional as you're going to be. Not everybody puts as much time in as you will. Not everybody understands the contracts like you do. Not everybody really gives a rip about anybody else's schedule or deadlines. So be prepared to be the responsible one, right? Like, if you were ever the one in group work that did most of the work, just get used to that sometimes. It's unfortunately what happens. And then there are other times you have a co-broke who's like the most magical person you've ever worked with. You learn so much from them. They catch a mistake you made and they let you fix it. And you're like, thank God. And they're wonderful. Like, every co-broke is a stinker, but the ones who are going to require you to be even more proactive and even more in your A game. They're going to teach you to be really on top of it and really as much in control as you possibly can be. And then there's going to be some times when you just have to kind of trust that it's going to work, and prepare your client for that and let them know this is kind of where we are, but here's what we could do. We could be ready with a notice. We could be ready with another amendment. But we need to know that, like, at the end of the day, if this agent isn't going to get back to us in time, these are our options. What would you prefer to do? Let's plan what we can. Let's have control of what we can. Yeah. And sometimes they'll just send it late and be like, here you go. I'm like, oh, thanks. Or it's like 5:02 and it shows up.
They
in your
have to
email and
wet
you've heard
sign
nothing from them. Oh, they have to wet sign too.
Yeah, she actually asked the seller the other day when we were on the phone, because she likes to 3-way call me with him on the phone so I can explain
Weird.
things to him. I know. She asked him if he was near the internet.
Near it?
Was the listing, did that post say in MLS that they had electronic consent?
I can't even remember. There were literally no documents. I had to email her to get the wrecker and the lead-based paint so I could have my client sign it when I submitted the offer. So
yeah,
like,
that's something.
Know who she is. Like, we can't figure anything out. I almost drove to their office today because I'm losing my mind. Yeah,
sometimes you got to get a manager involved. But that's a good point, and something I don't always check is in the MLS listing, it says if they have electronic consent or not. It's not always filled out correctly. So if you notice that the addendum S or the condition report are hand signed, it's not a bad idea to check in with them and just say, like, do you have electronic consent? Or if you ask, like, when you're turning in an offer, is X time a reasonable amount of time to get a reply? Do you need to drive to their house? Do you need them to fax it back? It's a good time to check in on that stuff. And if not, maybe if they wet sign the actual offer as acceptance, and just keeping that in mind when you send over documents, because finding that out like in the middle of it gets really messy. And that's happened to me where I haven't proactively addressed it, and then we're in the middle of it and they're like, sure, I can get it signed tonight, but I have to drive to the office and print it out, and then I have to drive to their house to get it signed, and I have to drive back to the office to scan it back to you, so I'll have it to you in 3 hours. I'm like, oh cool, it's 9 o'clock, our deadline is midnight. It's not great. So as much as you can be proactive about those details, that can help, but sometimes you just end up in these goofy spots and you got to do what you can to control what you can. And just let your buyer know, like, I'm doing everything I can. Here's our options. I've contacted the agent again. I've contacted their manager. Sometimes it gets a little weird. Any other scenarios that have come up related to the offer deadlines or anything else you've been working on?
I have a little, like a hint, something that I learned. I had to do an amendment to extend the loan commitment date. You know, and so I, you know, got the zip form, all that kind of stuff. And my mentor was like, oh, good hint at the bottom where it says the like reject, make sure you delete like the signature box before you send it. Otherwise they just go through. So I did do that, but I forgot that there also is an initial box that also needs to be deleted. So my buyers automatically just, you know, click through everything and they rejected their own amendment. So then I had to resend it and make sure I deleted the initial box as well.
Yeah, that's a quirky thing in zip forms. I've been meaning to ask Kimmy about that because I think it can be fixed in the
that's what I heard
in
too.
the template. But be careful anytime you're writing any document, anytime you're filling out any document, when you get it to the point of setting up signatures, don't just send it. Like scan through every page and make sure that the signatures there are what you need. What Bethany's referring to is in the amendment, there's signatures at the bottom for the buyer and the seller, and then there's also initials at the bottom for rejection or countering, I think, or no, it's just for rejecting.
I think it's reject only.
It automatically fills in boxes for initials on the rejection part as well. So, and then it's not a complete amendment. If the sellers sign it, the buyers sign it, and then also the buyer's initial rejection, you have to have it re-signed. So just be careful about those. Anything that autofills, I mean, rule of thumb, fill out your document and look at it carefully while you're filling it out. Then review it before you send it for signatures, including where the signatures are, what's filled in what boxes, who's supposed to sign what. After they sign it, review it again before you send it. There's so many things in there that could really affect your clients in a bad way, that it's worth the extra couple minutes, even if it's exciting and there's a deadline. It's really, really imperative that you're double checking all that stuff because goofy things like that can happen. I have definitely made those mistakes before. And then it's like, oh my God, if I hadn't caught it, if that other person hadn't caught it, if they didn't give us the grace to fix our mistake, we could have been in a really crappy position. So best case scenario, you're catching your own mistakes before somebody else does. Or your client, that's always bad. You fill it all out and they're like, well, what's up with this? It's like, zip form's supposed to autofill that. I don't know. I didn't put that there.
Yeah, that was me. Oh, I deleted the signature, but not the initial. Oh my gosh.
I didn't get that. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, it's glitchy. It's that, not me.
Yeah, totally the technology. Ugh. Anybody else?
I know another thing that I saw come up was like, especially with appraisals, is to like really push those dates out.
Yeah.
Because I'm dealing with a VA appraisal too, which is even more
Longer.
longer.
That's a really good point.
Why do you want to push them out?
They're taking forever.
Appraisals are taking forever. An appraisal on a typical conventional loan is like a one-time visit, and then they get the report back to you, but it can take up to 2 weeks or more, even after inspection sometimes, for them to even get out to the house. And then to get the report back to you can take another 3 to 14 days. And then the underwriter has to approve it, and then you can get clearance on it. So it's a long process, and they're very, very busy.
So on the listing side,
yeah.
Like I have an appraisal today at my listing, and they said to do a CMA and send it to the appraiser. Does that help speed things up for them a little bit?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I highly recommend if you have a listing, ideally you meet the appraiser there. So when I set up showing time for my listings, I don't allow for an automatic appraisal scheduling. They have to call me. And then I can set a time when I'm available as well, which granted, I got to be really flexible so they can get in as soon as they can.
Because I won't be there.
Sometimes they call the day before. But if you absolutely can't be there, to hand them a contract or a CMA and like a list of highlights about the property, at least emailing it to them is great. And they really appreciate it, especially right now. They're so busy. So we are not allowed to influence them, but we can certainly provide helpful information that they may choose to use or not. And I always tell that to my sellers too. Like, this is something I do as a courtesy to ensure that I'm doing everything I can to make sure that appraisal is accurate. Those folks are really busy. So I've got a sheet that points out all the highlights, all the reasons this house is awesome and worth a bunch of money.
Okay.
I have a market analysis with some notes about why the other comps are great or not. I've got anything about updates they've made, like just anything that makes this house, you know, as much information as they may need to say, like, this is an awesome house. Here's why it's unusual for the neighborhood. Here's why it's great for the, you know, this is justifies the price, whatever it is. But in a way that you're just presenting it as like factual information. You can't necessarily give them like a speech about why they should appraise it for what it's selling
So like
for.
I have a things to know that I made about the
Yeah,
house.
yeah,
that's
if you
there.
did that for the
So, like, I'll
listing,
just attach that. I was
throw it in
thinking.
there. Totally. Yep, absolutely. That can really be helpful to them. I really like meeting them at the house because then I can find out, like, you know, how are things going? You know, are you super busy? Do you usually turn in the reports like within so many days, or you kind of know when you'll have that sent in? You build a little rapport with them. It's not a bad thing, you know, just to get to see who did the work, get a feel for how they operate, find out when they're planning to turn in the report. Let them know if they have questions, they can always reach out to you. You're happy to provide information. But then when they're done, you can tell the seller, like, yes, I met the appraiser. They think they'll have the report back within a week. You know, it's just helpful info because you're the only one as a listing agent who has direct contact to that appraiser. Nobody else does. The
Yeah, I mean,
lender
it got
talks to a
scheduled for
third
me.
party.
It got scheduled for me, and I don't know if it was scheduled by my team, but it got scheduled for me yesterday. And then the appraiser texted me and was like, "Can I get a 1-day code to get in?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know this was happening, and I can't be there."
Yeah, if you can at least get their email and send them a packet and text them and say, like, hey, I just sent you some helpful info about the house for X appraisal tomorrow. Not a bad idea.
Cool.
Yeah, and if it's a VA or an FHA appraisal, they are looking for other health and safety issues. So they may spot peeling paint, they may spot a really bad roof, some of that kind of stuff. If that is not addressed in the inspection, which is always good to be proactive about that, if you know it's a VA or an FHA loan, look for that kind of stuff. And if you're not sure what they look for, ask a lender for a list of the things that a FHA or VA appraiser is going to look at. If there are problems that have to be addressed, the seller has to address them and the appraiser has to come back out to okay them before the report can be completed. And that can take a long time. So just keep that in mind if you're giving a closing date, loan commitment date, appraisal date. Again, when in doubt, check with the expert, talk to the lender that your buyer is working with, and make sure those dates and deadlines are going to be realistic.
So does the appraiser see then the inspection report and like
No,
the addendum?
No,
Do they see-
don't give it to them.
never send the inspection to the lender or
Right,
the
but
appraiser.
so, like-
never.
Okay, so like we just went through the addendum and we know what stuff that the seller is gonna fix. And they're not fixed yet. You know, we just got all of that.
This is the amendment for repair?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So the lender
appraisal-
does see that.
okay.
Yeah, the lender sees the amendment for repair. The appraiser may or may not see that. It's another reason why it's good to be there or at least have something on paper to say, hey, just FYI, this is going to be addressed. If it's something really obvious, they're not crawling all over the house like an inspector does. Typically, right. There's a few old school appraisers out there who do quite a lot. But they're so busy that they're usually like flying through the house. But if you, like if the roof on the garage looks crazy terrible,
So it's like
and you know it's a VHA.
Stuff, so they won't even see that.
Probably, no, they wouldn't, no. And it's really just if it's VA or FHA. Okay. And even so, if the work's not done, they still have to come out. But it doesn't hurt to say, this is already being addressed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I worked with my listing agent, all of us knowing it was VA, and our inspector was really great and pointed out, like 3 maybe red flags. And so we're working with the listing agent and the seller to proactively take care of it so that it passes the appraisal, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as best you can. And really, like, when you're first talking to a seller or when you first accept an offer, if it has VA or FHA, that's really the time to be like, okay, remember when I did my walkthrough of the house and we talked about the listing, we talked about different kinds of loans that we could get. I mentioned that peeling paint on the wood window frames outside could come up. Well, this is an example where this is going to come up. it may make sense to just scrape and paint this weekend and get it done so it doesn't delay everything else. You know,
Yep.
people get upset when they're caught off guard. So the more you can prepare them, and you're going to have to remind them 10 times. You can't just say it once and think they're going to remember. There's way too much going on in this process for them to remember. So make sure you're doing all you can to be proactive, to warn them, to have it on paper, to bring it up again, to discuss it. Especially right now, people's memories are terrible. And they're like, well, you never told me. That's when people get mad and you're like, but I did once at the beginning. You don't remember. So do what you can to be proactive with that stuff too. That's why I like having like a booklet or something to refer to so that people can go back to that when they start to freak out, or, you know, now it's time for appraisal. Let's review what that means. You know, this is FHA. This is what we should make sure is done. This is, you know, how long the time frame could be. This is how the appraiser works, you know, all that stuff. No, you don't have to be there for it, but I will, or however that will happen. Typically the buyer and the buyer's agent are not there for appraisal. It's usually just the listing agent, if anybody. And I saw Mike's question about FSBO. That is a long conversation for another time, but there are definitely some videos out there for that. If you do have somebody selling without an agent, usually they need a title company or an attorney. And honestly, if they need an attorney, they may as well pay an agent. They'll get more for their property and they don't have to pay somebody hourly. But there's a lot more to that too.
Yeah, I haven't even touched that. Ugh.
Yeah, not something I deal with very often, but every once in a while. All right, well, we're to our 11:30 time frame, and we started on time today, so we're not going to run long. But thanks all for sticking with me. I know this is a more boring part of the process, but it's so incredibly important that you understand the offer and fill them out completely, and that you know the way that you filled it out is the way that your client wants it, and that they understand how it's filled out. All those pieces are so, so important. Again, thank you to everybody who took the time to fill out offers. If you want to review more specifically the details of your offer, send me a text and we can set up an accountability call to talk more about it. I mean, overall, there's a lot of good stuff in here, and I think it's awesome that people are taking the time to really figure this out. You know, there's a new document for condos that just came out for offers, and there's an update to the offer to purchase. Nothing tremendous, but there's a few differences. And sorry if you can hear the seagull in the background. There's go away. There's a few differences that Steph Connard is going over tomorrow, and Kimmy also did a video on, so that's a good thing to go back to. Kimmy talked a bit about the condo offer changes in today's meeting. I am so proud to be part of this company. I can't believe the resources we have. I can't believe the educational opportunities we have. The amount of just figuring things out as I went that I had to do at my past broker for 4 years. I can't imagine how much farther I'd be if I had the resources that you do at your fingertips now. So take advantage of that stuff. And kudos to you for taking the time to jump on this call and, you know, making the effort to practice. It's really humbling, but it is so, so important. And you establish those great roots. You're just going to grow that much stronger as an agent, as a business. It's really going to serve you well. So kudos to you, and keep plugging away. Text me to set up those accountability calls, and remember to use that reference library in YouTube. There's some really excellent information in there. Also, the WRA website is a really excellent resource as well. They have some videos, they've got all the documents. Also a really great place to go if you have some really specific questions about the details of offers and other legal documents that we fill out on a regular basis. So thank you again for coming. You guys have a great day.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Good luck, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
All right,
yeah.
take care.
Bye.